Welcome to the Healthy Skin Show with Jennifer Fugo, where we're flipping everything you've been told about your chronic skin issues upside down and connecting you with alternative solutions your dermatologist never told you about.
Welcome back to episode number 63 of the Healthy Skin Show. In today's episode, I'm talking all about Dyshidrotic Eczema, which is the specific type of eczema that I have. Some of you know my story or you've heard fragments of it over the course of tuning in to the Healthy Skin Show. But I thought it was high time to share my own journey with you. While I am 95% in remission, I do not forget some of my worst moments. And I think it's important to start with a story that was one of the most frustrating, aggravating, and debilitating moments of my journey dealing with this type of eczema. I remember that I had traveled to an event up in Boston, and it was, I think, October at the time. So we're heading into fall. The weather is drying out. It's much cooler than in the summertime. And as I was on the train heading north from Philadelphia to Boston, I could feel my skin literally drying out. The further north we rode, the more my skin would dry. And as I began to bend my fingers, I got all of these little paper cuts in the little sections of my fingers where there were bends. And I got to the point, and this was a 6-hour train ride, mind you, that I could no longer move my hands. I'm sitting there thinking, how on earth am I going to grab my bag? I had never experienced this because it was really the first year of having eczema. My eczema in the summertime was completely different. It was red, angry, itchy, oozing, burning. But this whole dried out business was something entirely different. When I got to the hotel, I was in so much pain, crying as I was dragging my bag down the street because just holding the bag was incredibly painful. I found my way to a Whole Foods and I was so upset, crying in the skincare aisle. I just was desperate for some sort of relief. I found a salve and I bought these white cotton gloves that many of us who have hand eczema have used. And maybe you still use them today. That became my regimen of applying this salve and then wearing the gloves. I had to wear them in public to the event, and everyone's like, why are you still wearing gloves? We're inside. And I had to keep applying this salve with the hopes that I wouldn't develop any more of these little paper cuts, basically. It was one of the most mentally crushing moments of my experience living with eczema. I had been to dermatologists, but no one had prepared me for this. And I don't think there's any way to have been prepared for it. I just had no idea that this is what was going to happen to my skin because I was so used to, for a few months, it just being a completely different set of symptoms. I fortunately was able to make it through the winter without losing my mind. But in the process, I had to stop basically touching everything because I couldn't touch water. It was bad enough when my hands were red, angry, and itching and burning that water would burn. But think about it. Paper cuts in your hands hurt even more. It hurts because every time you move your hands, every time you grip a handle or you turn a doorknob or you go to shake someone's hand, it hurts. And it can go from hurting a little bit to a tremendous amount depending on how inflamed and swollen those little cuts were. Now, as I shared, I have come a long way with my skin rashes. A long way. I don't ever wish to go back. And I'm so grateful for all of the effort that I've put into it. However, it reminds me daily when I think back to moments like this, why it's so important that you know that you have other options. Because in the beginning of my journey, I didn't know what was wrong. All I knew was that I had these little clear bubbles underneath my skin, which is a hallmark of dyshidrotic eczema, which tends to affect the palms and the feet. Those little bubbles would eventually become very itchy. And it would become so itchy that they would almost like burst and ooze. And you would end up with this whole rashed area of skin that would begin to spread. So I would get these flares where it would affect one area, it would heal up after a certain point, and then it would flare again and become worse and worse and worse. And it began on one side of my finger, my middle finger. If you have a sense of humor, there you go. And it began to spread up the sides of the finger. It then affected the palms of my hands and then eventually began to destroy the growth of my nails so that they became very wavy and almost like divots in the nails themselves. So they were very unattractive. And eventually the knuckles became very thickened. Mind you, I did ask for help multiple times. And the dermatologist basically told me that this was just something I was going to have to live with. The first dermatologist that I saw was proud of me that I had been gluten-free, dairy-free, and egg-free for at least 6 years before the eczema appeared. But no one bothered to ask me if I had any current stressors or anything new going on in my life that could contribute to why this was happening. Instead, when I asked why my skin was doing this all of a sudden out of the blue, I got a shrug. "We don't really know," she said. "But what we do know is that a steroid cream can help reduce the inflammation and stop the flares. So here's a cream, and oh, by the way, in order to keep the moisture locked in, put some Vaseline on the rashes." I blinked twice. "Vaseline? Oh yes, it's really good. It's very occlusive, so it'll keep the moisture in your skin so it doesn't dry out." Now, take a moment to think about that. I have paper cuts, essentially paper cuts, all over my hands. So I have wounds everywhere that don't really heal well because I'm constantly having to bend my fingers to do pretty much anything. You want me to put Vaseline on my hands, which is a derivative of petrochemicals, number one. Number two, I don't really know how I'm supposed to function in life with Vaseline all over my hands from a very practical perspective because everything I touch, my clothing, my cats, my husband, my home, everything will be covered in Vaseline. So it was one of the most impractical suggestions, and frankly, it was not in alignment with my own health values, which I've talked about on other episodes. Aside from these two suggestions of steroid creams and Vaseline, I didn't really get any further with any dermatologist. Fortunately, my father, who's a doctor, had advised me and warned me to not overuse steroid creams because there can be problems with it. So I feel lucky in that I had family members who at least understood the condition from a medical perspective. But that said, not everybody in my life did. You have to consider the fact that not being able to use the palms of your hands can have a huge debilitating impact on the quality of your life. I couldn't wash my hands. I couldn't even touch water because of how badly it burned. I couldn't wash my hair, and I can tell you that no matter how tight gloves are, water will still find their way in. I could no longer go to the gym. I couldn't touch any of the weights or the equipment because I couldn't wash my hands. And I ended up, as a result of not wanting to get my hands dirty or touch anything in my home, wearing these blue gloves that I bought at Home Depot. I would keep a spare pack of those gloves in my car as well as my handbag. That way I was always prepared if the pair of gloves that I was using broke or ripped. I also found, unfortunately, that people are not too cool with shaking your hands when they don't look normal. They become uncomfortable to touch you, especially strangers, because they think that you're infected or dirty. And I don't necessarily blame them. But it doesn't make that instant where a person tries to bail out of shaking your hand hurt any less. And I also had to stop teaching cooking classes, which was one of the things at the time that brought me the most joy. Eventually, I started to feel like someone had cursed me. And I would ask myself and other people if maybe I had done something bad in a previous life, or if somebody had put the maloika on me. I had no idea what the heck happened and why I deserved this. I had tried so hard to take care of my health. I was in the middle of grad school studying to become a clinical nutritionist. And I thought to myself, why on earth would anyone want to work with someone whose hands are a wreck? Thankfully, my husband was there to help talk me off the ledge, so to speak, at a moment when I really felt like throwing in the towel. I had become incredibly depressed. I had withdrawn from going to social engagements and hanging out with people whom I knew, and I certainly didn't want to meet anyone new because I really didn't want to be stared at or asked what was wrong, or only to be told that I was doing something wrong and didn't know how to wash my hands and I should try this moisturizer, even though that person had no idea what exactly was wrong. I had just had it with the unsolicited advice and was ready to become a hermit in my home. And that's when my husband said to me that I should take this as an opportunity to look at my skin puzzle from a different perspective. He said, what if a client came to you with this problem? How would you begin to address it? How would you look at it differently than the doctor would? And that moment was the game changer, where I began to Google different natural remedies, only to find that they didn't really help all that much, except for sometimes stave off a flare or reduce it or lessen it or make the itching a tad more bearable. But I began to find pieces of the puzzle hidden in different websites and ways of addressing other health problems that weren't necessarily being applied to skin issues. So on a whim, I created a protocol for myself based off of what I thought was possibly going on. I didn't have any testing to go off of except for some regular blood labs. And to be honest with you, for the first 6 months, I had no idea if what I was doing even was working. And by the way, for those of you wondering, but what did you do? I'm not going to share exactly what I did, because I know that you think that what helped me will help you. And that's not necessarily the case, because my triggers, my root causes are likely different than yours. And I'll also admit that my protocol at the time wasn't really fleshed out and as knowledgeable as what I know now, because I didn't have access to all of the information and the research that I do in this very moment. So knowing what exactly I did isn't important, but what you do need to know is that, first of all, I started to reduce stress and made a really serious, consistent effort to do so. Number 2, I was much more serious about eating home-cooked food as opposed to frozen packaged gluten-free products that were easy to heat up. I also began packing my diet full of lots of nutrition, especially nutrition that would help rebuild my gut. And I also made the slight guess that supporting my liver in the process with the right nutrients would likely be helpful. So for 6 months, I soldiered on, flare after flare after flare. I had no idea if this was working. I kept blindly following and trusting that I was doing something right. And after about 6 months, my skin flares slowed down. And eventually the time between flares got longer and longer, to the point where the flares finally stopped. That whole process took me about a year. From there, it took time for the skin around my knuckles to soften and look less thickened. And after about 6 months, finally, my nails began to grow out normal. I have had a handful of flares since I was able to finally rebuild healthier skin. Those typically correlated with times where I drastically changed my diet, or I was traveling and didn't have the capacity to take the supplements that I normally consume in a protein shake because, as many of you know, I cannot swallow pills. So I usually take things that are mixed in a shake. That said, I have at this point in time so much gratitude for what eczema has taught me. If it weren't for eczema, I wouldn't know all of the things that I know now. I wouldn't know the level of pain and suffering that people like you and I go through on a daily basis. You can't fully understand the type of hell that skin rashes are unless you live in it or you're watching someone close to you go through it. And while my journey seemed like it was over, I realized that I was actually at the beginning of my own journey. Not the end, but the beginning. Because now was the opportunity to give back and help everyone like yourself who's struggling, who's looking for answers, find the answers that I've found. I threw myself into research, connecting with experts and functional medicine doctors and researchers to ask the tough questions, to dig, and to connect the dots that just aren't being connected. And so I hope that as you listen to this story and you understand that I'm in this boat with you, I still occasionally have flares and I have a deep understanding of what you are going through, that you are not alone. That's why I created Skinterrupt. It's why I host the Healthy Skin Show. If just one person is helped, then all of this is worth it. To me, that is what is most important. If you've got any questions about dyshidrotic eczema or my own personal journey, head on over to skinterrupt.com/063 and leave a comment so we can continue the conversation there. And remember to subscribe to the show and rate and review the Healthy Skin Show on your podcast platform of choice. And by the way, it does mean a lot. I read them all. So go on over and leave your thoughts about either this episode or the show in general. And if you get a chance and know somebody who's really struggling with eczema, whether they have it on their hands or anywhere else, please share this episode with them so that they know that they are not alone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.